Hi there, it's good to have you in our show, in our Pensioen Pro Partner webinar. My name is Tom Jessen and I'm your host in the coming 60 minutes. We will tell you all about Japan in this partner webinar, another episode of Pensioen Pro Partner webinar today about Japan with our partner Nikko Asset Management. Before I will introduce my guest of today, I first will explain you all about how you can participate in our show today. Maybe you have some questions at this point. Please put them in our chat. I think you know how to do that. Put them there and our team behind the scenes will select the questions I can ask my guest later on in this show. So please feel free to participate and ask all the questions or remarks you have. My guest of today is John Vail. He is Chief Global Strategist at Nikko Asset Management. And before I will give the words to him, I will tell something about his background. Because he has over 35 years experience in the Asian stock market. He started working in Japan in 1988 and he started at Nikko Asset Management in 2006. And besides his work for Nikko Asset Management, he is also the chairman of the Global Investment Committee. And from this point of view, he has a good, excellent view of all the global stock markets and economy. Please welcome John Vail. Nice to have you in our show. Good to have you.
Thank you, Tom, and good day to you and to all the participants out there. I normally don't do this, but I'd like to start by reading the first few paragraphs of a report we've just published called Unlocking Hidden Value in Japan. And in the foreword written by our new president, Stephanie Drews, she writes the following. For the past few decades, there's been a general sense that global equity investors should be underweight Japan. After all, investors have been hearing the same criticisms repeated for decades. Conventional wisdom says Japan is a country encumbered by a shrinking and aging population, stagnant growth, and a stale corporate culture, and should therefore be avoided. Such criticisms are inaccurate and outdated. While many global investors still only see the Japan of the past, they are missing out on the way that Japan is shaping all of our futures. The Japan of today is one where a decade of corporate and stock market reforms has started to bear fruit, and where successive governments have prioritized revitalizing the Japanese economy. This has created a more shareholder-friendly environment and is helping companies to deliver vastly improved profit margins, which I'll talk about later, thanks to superior technology, stronger corporate governance, and particularly from within the Asia-Pacific region, better economic growth. So with that, I encourage you to read the entire report. I believe it's really quite excellent and quite useful. I'd like to move to a few of the slides, and starting on the ESG front, I really wish to submit that Japan is an extremely ESG friendly country. It's a very safe place to invest. Environmentally, as you can see on the first slide, it's extremely successful in patent technology for carbon neutral strategies, leading the world by a long shot for a decade or more in carbon neutral strategies. And also in the field of hydrogen, it also leads the world in patents and has done so since 2001. So the technology in Japan is extremely good. It's a very environmentally conscious country. It certainly is a very clean country, as you know, and a very energy efficient country. And I think that will hold it in great stead as we move into a more carbon neutral country. If you advance to the next slide, you can see that it's in many different areas where Japan leads in environmental patents. It's not just in hydrogen, but also in the transport sector, in power semiconductors, in all things that are energy efficient. And one reason for that, obviously, is because Japan is completely dependent on energy and commodity imports, and therefore it's always learned to be very conservation minded as to how they use their commodities. You can see that in the fact that the average car in Japan is actually quite small, especially in the countryside, and how most people use mass transit to get around in the cities. So I'll leave it there for a first introduction, and I'm sure we'll get into all the other points once Thomas starts asking some questions, and once you, the participants, have a chance to ask further questions.
That's great to hear. Thank you, John. Let's start with some questions in general about Japan, because I think a lot of people in the Netherlands don't know enough about Japan. Is that also the view you have, that there is less knowledge about Japan in Europe and especially in the Netherlands?
Well, it's certainly true that many people have not paid a lot of attention to Japan in the past because they were all paying attention to China.
Yeah.
And that's still very important to watch, extremely important. But Japan has now sort of come from the shadows, is now being watched much more closely, not only by investors, but also by governments. And there's been a renewed strengthening of the relationship between Japan and the US, and with continental Europe, and also with the UK, with its new free trade agreement with the UK. So in general, the Western media tends to have a very, I wouldn't say negative, but sort of standoff relationship about Japan. And certainly it's not a perfect country, but it's much better than they report. It has many Asian attributes which are sort of hard to understand at times. They're quite different from Western traditions in many, many ways. But by now the country is pretty much a hybrid, and it's not as hard to understand.
Exactly. When you compare Japan with Europe and the Netherlands, what are the similarities?
Well, I don't know the Netherlands as well as I should, perhaps, but clearly they're great long-term powers that have been trading-oriented powers, at least for the last 3 decades for Japan. Well, actually, almost 2 decades for Japan, and two centuries for Japan, excuse me. And yes, I think the Netherlands is also very energy conscious and very ESG minded.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's some similarities there.
Exactly. Okay. When we talk about Japan in general, then there are also misconceptions. Maybe we can zoom in on a few misconceptions. Take it away, please.
Well, let's move to the first one that I mentioned briefly in the introduction, and that's the next slide. It's the demographics question, and I've been hearing it for 20 plus years as a reason not to invest in Japan. And of course, it's been a headwind to some degree. But if you look at the chart, it's just really quite remarkable how in Japan's case, there's an inverse correlation between corporate profits and the working age population, which has been declining since the year 2000. And you can see that the corporate profits have surged by about threefold during that time. So if a country like Japan can use its technology, its expertise in doing business, its improvement in corporate governance, and just overall improvement in how they conduct their affairs, that they can easily, I shouldn't say easily, they can definitely overcome the demographics factor. And that's a very important thing to notice, because there are a lot of countries out there that are facing demographic headwinds, if not cliffs. I mean, China is facing a huge cliff and a gender imbalance, but Korea, most of developed Europe and part of emerging Europe are facing similar consequences. But it's good to know that if you work hard, you can overcome the demographic challenge. Mm-hmm. As for the other one on the next slide that I wanted to point out, this shows in greater detail. Many people say, well, a stagnant domestic economy means that you have stagnant profits. And for the same reasons that I mentioned above, you can see that corporate profit margins, as I guess you could be alluded from the prior slide, have zoomed in Japan, and it's just way above anything in the past. It actually started about 2005 when I first moved back to Japan from the States, where the Koizumi reforms started to impact the corporate governance structure here, and it reformed some of the way that the government oversaw business. And so just you look at the light blue line in the chart, you can see that domestic GDP growth has been quite low during that period. So it's once again, it's good to know that if Japan can do it, other countries can do it, but Japan has done it probably exceptionally well. And don't let anyone tell you that demographics or low domestic GDP growth means necessarily that corporate profits or the stock market won't do very well, because it's just very untrue in the case of Japan, and likely untrue in other countries as well if they really step up and address their challenges.
Mm-hmm. So despite these facts, Japan is very interesting for everybody.
Should be. It's really coming into fruition from all the efforts that have been made, and yet still underappreciated. Really, a lot of the global investors and the media still don't appreciate how much improvement has been made. Mm-hmm. And the valuations are very low, probably the lowest, amongst the lowest in the world, at 11 times forward earnings, and earnings estimates are still growing, compared to about 15 times in Europe, and about it's down to about 16 and a half in the US, down from 20 just a few months ago. But yes, dividend yields here are very competitive. Interest rates are low. The inflation problem that exists in the rest of the world is very much less problematic here. There's very little structural inflation in Japan. Wages have not been rising. They're not strikes. They're not discombobulations of the internal supply chain due to strikes or workers not showing up to work, or there being huge job vacancies. So Japan is really quite a stable place, and probably will be so in the next 10 years. It's very politically stable, and there's no reason to expect that will change. And that will be a shining example in the world, I'm afraid, over the next 5 to 10 years of political stability.
Exactly. That's very interesting. Let's also talk about the political landscape later on. But first, maybe you can learn us something about all the improvements, all the efforts that are done to improve Japan as a country and the economy and the businesses. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's come in waves. I mean, you've probably heard the term Abenomics and such things, cutting taxes, loosening up regulations. They've been pushing companies to increase their corporate governance. There have been strong corporate reforms that have been forced by the government on companies. And to a large extent, the companies, I wouldn't say uniformly, but the vast majority of them have really listened. And another reason why corporate governance has improved so much here is because back in the 2005 period, that's when activists started to really enter Japan in a major way. And some companies tried to set up poison pills, and they were rejected by the court system here. And so companies realized that if they don't improve their profit margins and improve their governance, then they will be taken over, which is the last thing they want. And so they've tried very hard to avoid being targets of activists. And despite their improvements, there still are some companies that need a push, shall we say, and that the number of companies that are sort of under activist pressure, with shareholders over 5% or so being activist investors, has reached an all-time high. So companies are very busy doing buybacks. I mean, for instance, the buyback so far this year, which is only like in this fiscal year's ended March in Japan. So far in basically the 2 months since the beginning of this fiscal year, they've already hit about 4.2 trillion yen of share buyback announcements, which is over half of the total buybacks last year. So there's a surge in buybacks, and companies are extremely conscious of getting their share prices to a fair level. Those are just 2 or 3 small facts of what's happened on the corporate governance front and on the economic front.
And I see. Interesting to hear. Very interesting. Maybe then let's talk about the political landscape. What can you learn us about the government in Japan?
Well, as I think you and maybe your listeners all know, Japan's been under the control of the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, for all but about a year or 2 since the end of the war. And they're a pro-business party. They've obviously morphed at times where they've had more aggressive reformers leading, and other times where it's been a little bit more traditional leadership. And for the past, 8-9 years, it's been under reformists. And that's been very good for Japan and for its economy overall, although there's been some hardships involved, no doubt, to certain segments of society, to certain businesses. And as for the stock market, it's been a tremendous boon. There's no, like I said before, there's no reason to expect that the LDP is going to lose power. And Japan's a very politically stable country. The LDP is very popular. The current prime minister is very popular. They've handled the lockdowns very logically, and the way that the people overall wanted it to be done. The Constitution here is actually very restrictive in terms of human rights, in terms of what the government can tell people to do. The government has no ability to force lockdowns here. They've encouraged it, and it was voluntarily, although strongly encouraged, and most people obeyed. the vast majority of people obeyed. And that's the way sort of should be, isn't it? I mean, these forced lockdowns were traumatic for many people in various countries around the world, particularly the United States.
Mm. Actually, Japan is a big island, isn't it? How is the influence of the neighborhood countries?
Well, Japan has North Korea that's not too far away, which is always been a source of concern, although not a reason to avoid the stock market or to expect doom and gloom. Its relationship with China has gone through some bumps, obviously, and still is a bit tense. But for the most part, the Chinese want Japan to be not necessarily an ally, that's impossible, I guess, but someone that they do not want to make an enemy of or to be uncooperative with. And that's really quite good for Japan. Japan joins the G7 and multilateral efforts to make China aware of the criticisms that are made primarily from the West, and participates in those efforts, like I say. But at the same stage, the relationship is not broken, and neither side wants to break it completely. That said, Japan is, like almost every other country in the world, trying to decrease its dependence on China for its supply chains, while still achieving good business results within that country. Japan is very close to Taiwan. They have very strong alliance, I guess you could say. And Japan is extremely concerned about what happens to Taiwan.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the most of the neighborhood, though. South Korea obviously is important, and there have been some problems there, but there's great hope, I mean, very strong hope that with the new president in South Korea that things will improve. I wouldn't say hope. I mean, there's a very strong likelihood that things will improve dramatically on that front.
When you have questions to John, please feel free to ask. We have our chat open for you, so please put all your questions or remarks there, and then we can discuss. Maybe, John, I think it's also important to let's take a look at all the companies that are located in Japan, because I think we know the most famous, the most well-known companies, but maybe you can give a short overview of the companies who are located for a long time in Japan.
Do you mean Japanese companies or foreign companies that are located in Japan?
I mean the local companies, but also the companies from abroad.
Well, multinationals have a pretty big presence here, especially things like McDonald's and Microsoft and Intel and Cisco and all the big major companies, except for maybe the auto companies, where Japan is just so dominant. It's hard to jump in, especially when your steering wheel is on the incorrect side of the road. Incorrect side of the car. But Japan has a lot of companies that you've probably never heard of that are just extremely important companies, and a lot of them are in the component manufacturing companies. I mean, a good chunk of the highest caliber components within an iPhone are Japanese companies like Murata or Toyo or the camera lens companies. So that's true not just in iPhones, but in a huge number of products around the world. Japan Inside, I guess you could sort of call it, sort of like the Intel Inside moniker that they have. In other areas, Japan is a big leader in robotics. There's a company called Fanuc that overwhelmingly dominates the global robotics industry. Japan has some of the largest drug manufacturing companies in the world. You haven't heard about them much because they were not leading in the vaccine development. But I think you'll find that if you look at the Wikipedia site for Takeda Pharmaceutical, you'll see that it's one of the largest companies in the world, and that it has purchased a lot of international companies over the years, and has strengthened its brand, and has added to the human health condition globally. I could go on for a long time about this, but there are many companies in Japan that are world leaders, and you just don't always hear about them.
So that's important to know. Maybe also a question that is related to the political story, the policy of the government. How easy is it to enter the Japanese market as a company from abroad? Because we all know the stories from China, but I guess it's different in Japan, but maybe you can explain.
Well, I will say that Japan is not easy to succeed in, and it's either for a foreign company or for a Japanese company. The Japanese have very high standards, not only for the quality of the merchandise, but the servicing of the merchandise after it's sold. Extremely high demands, and there are many companies in the West who have stuck it out and have listened to Japanese advice from their local partners or from their staff, and do things the way the Japanese find attractive. And so there are many companies here that are extremely successful, foreign companies, but it takes a lot of work, and it's not something that one should think about doing lightly.
Okay, so that's good to know. Have you got some examples of companies, domestic companies who enter the market? So not domestic companies from Japanese perspective, but from Europe perspective, who enter the Japanese market last year or last years?
I think, if you looked at stories like Lululemon or Shake Shack, I mean, they have a presence here now.
Yeah.
You might not know those companies in Netherlands, but one is a yoga wear manufacturer and distributor. It's very big in the States, very successful company. You've got companies like Expedia who are doing business quite actively here. Airbnb is doing quite big business here. Other sort of recent entrants, I mean, I obviously don't need to mention Microsoft or any of the majors. They've been around for ages, but yeah, like I mentioned, Shake Shack is one of the fastest growing hamburger retailers in the States, and that's growing here. And tech companies in general have a presence here. I mean, Dropbox and a lot of companies here have been very successful on the internet front. Amazon is huge here.
Yeah,
it's absolutely huge. As for Dutch companies, I'm not as well aware, or obviously, the semiconductor production equipment like ASML and countries like Royal Dutch and other consumer staple companies have done extremely well here over the years.
Yeah, that's clear, John. One incoming question on this moment from Ian. Thank you, Ian, for asking this question. Here it is. How has Japan benefited in the last years from Asia's growth in the past, and what are your thoughts on this moving forward, John?
Well, it's a good question, and the answer is tremendously so. I mean, Japan has extremely good trade relations with not only China and Taiwan and even Korea, but with ASEAN and it's pushing really hard with its business with India. And so all those countries tend to grow at a faster rate than the rest of the world. And they've been absorbing Japanese exports, being the home for Japanese companies to set up factories. Vietnam is a very good example of Japan's expansion in the region. So yes, that's been tremendously positive and will continue to be so. Looking forward, I think it's fairly easy to predict that Asia will continue to grow faster than the global economy. It has had a crisis or two in the past. 1997 comes to mind, but if you look at that now in retrospect, it was just a blip on the upward march of the Asian economy. So Japan has very good political relations as well as trade relations with those countries, and is likely to be a great beneficiary of Asia's growth going forward.
Mm. Also, some incoming questions from our audience, John. Different questions about the amount of the total asset market. Maybe you can help us out there.
Well, it's true that a lot of these ASEAN countries are quite small. It's quite hard for a big global pension fund to invest in, especially on a non-index basis, I guess you could say. But there are very strong opportunities for stock picking within China. We have an extremely good China team and a very good and large joint venture partner there. China's capital markets are huge by now. Japan's capital market is still very respectable, even at its low PE ratio. These are all examples of countries where it's not hard for global pension funds to get invested. South Korea and Taiwan are emerging markets by MSCI's classification, but not by FTSE's definition, I believe, at least for Korea. And there's some forex constraints about getting in and out of those markets, but something that a long-term investor shouldn't worry themselves about. Those two countries I just mentioned are not emerging market countries. They're some of the biggest economies in the world, have some of the most major stocks to invest in the world, like Samsung and TSMC. So not every stock, obviously. Japan's got thousands of stocks, and that's where some of the value is in some of the smaller ones. That's where we excel in many cases. But yes, the capital markets on both for stocks and bonds are very large in Japan and Korea, and to a lesser extent in Taiwan and Korea.
Mm-hmm. From the pension funds who are already participated in the Japanese market, what are the reasons they give you or colleagues to be there, to participate there?
Well, I think some of them really realize what I've been talking about here, that Japan is still coming forth with reforms that is still bearing fruit, and that the valuations are low, provides an excellent diversification, just like the global portfolio theory suggests. It's not always at least correlated with the rest of the world. It outperforms at times, it underperforms at times. Different sectors that it concentrates on. So in all, I think it's a very good diversification market, as well as one that has a lot of potential to outperform the rest of the world going forward, to be honest. Given the US is sort of in a derating mode, and Europe is certainly unfortunately suffering from very large exposure to the Ukraine crisis. Japan seems to sort of stand out right now as uh, an island of stability and a country that can be a good place to invest.
Okay. Nice remarks in our chat. Interesting story of John. So that's good to hear, I guess. And we have also another question from Mark. Here it is. What would be the trigger for a possible re-rating of the Japanese equity markets? Have you any thoughts?
Well, that's an extremely good question. I mean, obviously, I think in the short term, I actually think a stabilization of the yen would be quite helpful for foreigners to come in. In that, I mean, a lot of the money that you're making, stock market was lost in the currency market if you didn't hedge. Although I will say that Japan had been underperforming in constant currency terms, like in US dollar or euro terms. It doesn't matter which one you choose, but in constant currency terms, unhedged. That it actually has bounced back recently and is competitive once again with global markets. Obviously, more success with unlocking value by some of the activist investors. The fact that Japan will begin to shine more brightly as a stable and safe place to invest could dawn on a lot of global investors. And obviously, like with all global markets, if the US Treasury bond starts to calm down, which I personally think it will at this stage, I think we've hit the maximum expectation for Fed tightening. It might be a little bit dicey for a while in terms of some cockroaches that come out of the woodwork during a slowdown of economic growth. But I think the stabilization of the US Treasury bond will help, because that is one of the reasons why the yen has been so weak, is because the US Treasury bond has been also so weak and the yields have risen so much. So those are some of the things that I'm looking at right now. But overall, hopefully documents like the one we've just produced and presentations by companies like ours will continue to convince investors, particularly in Europe and in the States, that investing in Japan is quite a bargain right now, especially if the yen stabilizes. The yen assets are remarkably inexpensive. I mean, real estate in Japan now is really quite a bargain, and you can expect quite a lot of foreign money to start flowing into this country, I think, and that will help to stabilize the yen as well.
And how realistic is this scenario you gave us of stabilization?
A stabilization of the U.S. Treasury bond, I think, is likely at this point. I think because, like I said, I think expectations for the Fed hiking through next year have pretty close to reach their peak, barring, of course, some disaster in Ukraine or in Iran or in, I guess you could say, the States. Barring that, you could see, and I would say, inflationary shocks for those areas. That would be a problem for the U.S. Treasury market. But I think you'll see, I don't mean to get too short term here, but I think the month-to-month increases in the core CPI and the core PCE have reached their, will decelerate. They won't go down to pre-sort of COVID levels, but they'll be a much more acceptable sort of 0.25 to 0.3% month-on-month prints going forward, and that will calm a lot of nerves, in my view.
Okay, another question. Thank you for all your good questions and interesting questions. Please keep them in our chat, so send them to our chat. This is a question about the small or large caps. Do you have a preference for Japanese large or small caps? The latter more insulated from global issues.
Um, I don't necessarily have a preference between the two. I mean, there's many different kinds of small cap shares. There are the hyper growth ones, and then there's sort of the more stodgy ones, and it's sort of hard to characterize them um, in their entirety overall. Um, Large cap companies here, I have a great amount of faith in, barring sort of a handful of them. They really know what they're doing. They're very, very successful companies. Um, they've been criticized in the past for being too stakeholder oriented and caring about their employees, not wanting to fire them, that sort of thing. But now there's a little bit less pressure on that. It's a little bit more comforting for investors to know that they have stable stakeholders. As for small caps, I mean, we try very hard, and so do a lot of other people to find out companies where there's a lot of hidden value, and and trying to help these companies not only in the short term, so not sort of like green mailing kind of situations, but actually helping them unlock value in their companies and helping them with their share price. And there are still quite a few of those companies, and that's where stock picking can make a world of difference as opposed to index investing. And it's probably one of the areas where Japan fund managers, including ourselves, have been the most successful over the past decade or so is in that field. So I would highly recommend, looking at that field for pension fund investors.
Clear story. John, now all restrictions about COVID are gone. Would you advise to visit Japan to experience all the things you mentioned?
Well, yes, it's still very hard to get in here, at least until the upper house election, the sort of the smaller body equivalent to the Senate in the States. That election is happening in the middle of July, and prior to that, I think the government's being extra cautious about opening up because, to be honest, the prime minister's and the cabinet's popularity does tend to rise and fall with the approval rating on how they're handling the pandemic. And so right now, really only tour groups can come in, and they're not allowed to use public transportation. They have to follow orders pretty closely. But I think after this election, I think things will open up pretty fast because there's so much political pressure from the regions, because it's the regions that have benefited the most from inward tourism. And the spas, the onsens in the mountains, and the ski areas in the mountains, and just the beautiful nature reserves. Japan is a treasure for enjoying nature with clean air and whatnot. And so, an excellent skiing slopes, not just in Hokkaido, but all the way down the northern part of the Japanese Alps. It's remarkably a good place for tourism. I don't think I've ever met anybody who's really been unhappy visiting Japan and learning more about it. It's really quite a remarkable and a unique country. It's not perfect, that's for sure, but it's really quite a special place to visit.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for sharing this advice. Then we have a question from Wouter. Thank you. Regarding ESG, he told us, is this also a topic of government central bank policy? Also, because you are seeing the European Union, for example, the SFDR policy.
Everyone in Japan is quite conscious of the ESG challenge in almost every respect. And even the Bank of Japan is involved in aiding those efforts through credit facilities. and it invests a certain percentage of its assets in such companies here. Well, I think you know the corporate story, but they're even instilling quotas for female representation now on boards and in higher management. As for the government, yes, they're highly conscious of it, and they're not the fastest country to change things. Things don't happen, turn on a dime here, as they say in the States. They don't happen really quickly, but when they do, it's sort of an unstoppable force, and they're definitely in that mode right now, and one can expect better and better news on the ESG front going forward.
Okay. Another question. Growth has corrected already significantly. Is it already time to buy Japanese growth stocks? What do you think?
When they start with growth, they mean growth stocks. I mean, or the stock market growth. I'm not sure, but is it time to buy Japanese growth stocks? Well, it's a global phenomenon, clearly, and these kinds of stocks have been tremendously hurt around the world. Korea, Japan, US, probably even Europe. I don't know European growth stocks so well. But it's been painful. It's been very, very painful, and valuations have come way down. And I think if you're looking in a very long-term view, if you pick the right ones, I think it's saying the obvious here. If you pick the right ones, you're going to be very happy 10 years from now. And we're in a situation right now that has been called catching a falling knife. You know, it's not fun to try to buy some of these stocks and see them go lower because there's such a strong global trend. But I will say that if I am right about the US Treasury bond, and to a lesser extent, but importantly so, other global bonds, including European bonds, stabilizing. Although I'm less confident of the European bonds stabilizing as I am the US Treasury bonds at this stage. Any stabilization, at least on the U.S. Treasury bond, would probably help growth stocks. We'll have to see, the earnings announcements and the guidance. It's going to be very important. You've gotten a lot of poor guidance coming out globally after the first quarter, and there'll probably be some more challenging guidance after the second quarter, or even before the second quarter earnings come out. There'll be some earnings warnings, but not all companies are doing badly, and many are still beating expectations in the growth stock area. So, like with anything, if you pick the right stocks, growth or value, you're going to be very well rewarded over the long term.
Okay. A more general question, John, to you. What is the biggest challenge Japan will face in the coming years?
Well, I guess I'd have to say dealing with the rest of the world. I mean, the problems really that are happening within the stock market here are foreign-led. I mean, the problems are not within Japan. And Japan finding a way to maintain reasonable relations with the rest of the world and benefiting from long-term economic growth is a bit of a challenge, but Japan is very good at it, and it's going to be, yes, hard work, and let's just cross our fingers that things can somehow improve in all the global crises out there. But in the meantime, I mean, I think Japan's as safe a place to be as any in terms of the international or the global exposure to the world's problems right now.
That's clear.
Because it has so few of their own.
Yeah. John, do you have any advice for everybody who likes to know more about Japan or Nikko Asset Management?
Well, sounds a bit selfish, but I really do think that reading the report that we've just written will be very educational. Try to avoid the traditional media and the people who think that the Western way is the only way to succeed in the world, and that any third way is doomed to failure. Don't listen to all the doomsayers about demographics or low domestic economic growth or less than Wild West corporate governance scenarios. Try to avoid listening to the traditional criticisms and look past them, look deeper, and see the positive changes that are happening here.
Okay, that's great to hear. I would like to thank you, John, for joining us today. Thanks for the lessons you learned us about Japan. Thank you.
My pleasure, Tom. Good luck to you and to all of you out there.
When you have questions, please feel free to ask in our chat. We can give you some contact information about John, for example, or maybe we can also give you some information about Nikko Asset Management. We also have a replay of this show in the coming days. We will send you a link. You will receive the link in your email, and then you can watch these episodes later on, or maybe you can share it with colleagues or other people you know who are interested in the beautiful country Japan and all the possibilities that are located there. Thank you for joining us. We have also a short review form. We will publish that form into our chat. Maybe you can take 1 minute to fill it in, because then we can improve other webinars of Pensioen Pro. Thank you for joining us. Thanks again to my guest, John, and I hope to see you back in the future. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.